He was an engineer who flew, a human bridge between the worlds of aircraft designers and aircraft pilots, worlds that were not always in harmony. For 10 years, he dominated flight testing as a test pilot who had days when he'd fly missions in 3 different experimental aircraft. He flew every one of the legendary X-planes. He was the first man to break Mach 2 and the first to break Mach 3. He helped conceive and was the first to fly the X-15, the rocket plane that paved the way to outer space. He was too outspoken to make the cut as a Mercury astronaut, but signed on with NASA as a consulting engineer. He played a key part in the design of both the rocket that took men to the moon and the command module that brought them home. He is Scott Crossfield, and he is a legend of air power. Albert Scott Crossfield was born October 2nd, 1921, in Berkeley, California. His father, Albert, was a chemistry professor who left the security of academia for the adventure of the oil business in Southern California. At a young age, rheumatic fever laid Scott flat. He spent long periods in bed, isolated from other children, but determined to lead a normal life. Scott's father arranged for the boy to go up in an Eagle Rock biplane. The 6-year-old climbed into the front cockpit for what his father assumed would be the adventure of his young life. He fell asleep as soon as the plane left the ground. By the time he was 12, he was a fixture at Wilmington Airport, south of Los Angeles. He delivered newspapers to the pilots and helped wash mud from airplanes that had landed on the airport's unpaved landing strip. He took his pay in flying lessons and learned to fly secretly without his parents' knowledge. A combination of economic depression and creeping dissatisfaction with the industrial life drove the Crossfields out of Southern California. In 1935, when Scott was 14, his father packed the family up and headed north.
So we moved up to a farm in the state of Washington, and he and I built that farm over the next few years. Got it back on a profitable basis. Probably was a godsend for me in my physical condition because I didn't have time, wasn't allowed to be sick. That was my father's nature. And I got to be a pretty strong farm kid and managed to get along pretty well after that physically.
Even if he had left his monthly flying lesson behind, flight was never far from Crossfield's mind. He joined the civilian pilot training program in the late 1930s and studied engineering at the University of Washington for 2 years. In need of tuition money, he was working on the A-20 assembly line at Boeing in Seattle when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor.
I was determined I was going to fly in the war. I knew damn good and well I had a bigger job getting into the Air Corps and the Navy than I had flying. And I managed to work that through many devious channels.
First, he enlisted in the Army Air Force. When he arrived in Arizona for training, he found himself just one of thousands of new recruits arriving at a base almost completely unprepared to accept them.
We just got off the train and they gave us a ticket home and said, "Don't call us, we'll call you."
Crossfield returned to Boeing, watching the A-20s roll off the line and thinking that he should be flying airplanes, not building them.
So I switched over and went over to the Navy, and they were glad to snatch up a potential Army recruit.
He made the cut as a fighter pilot, but was assigned not to combat, but to Corpus Christi, Texas as a gunnery instructor. For the next 2.5 years, Crossfield pestered his commanders for a combat assignment. In late 1944, the Navy relented and ordered him to report to Air Group 51 for combat training. Air Group 51 was training for what would be the biggest, deadliest battle in human history, the invasion of Japan. Crossfield didn't care because he was at long last on his way to the action.
I have to get in it and probably won't live through it. Generally, that had to be the attitude. You see, we're taking on two of the biggest navies and armies in the world.
His last stop before going overseas was Pearl Harbor. Assigned as a Hellcat pilot to the aircraft carrier Langley, he arrived to find Hawaii a paradise preparing for a major escalation of war. The harbor and the ocean were covered with ships riding low in the water, packed to the gunwales with men and materiel. There were hundreds of aircraft and more carriers than he could count. Every few days, Crossfield's unit would go for exercises with the 2nd Marines on Maui. The Marines were preparing to go ashore in Japan. Crossfield would fly close air support, taking aim at positions that would, in Japan, be occupied by thousands or even millions of armed enemy.
I can remember just thinking, in less than a month, all of that's going to be on the bottom, because it was going to be a tough fight to get into Japan.
The Marines he knew were going to get slaughtered. The only way to overcome the Japanese defensive advantage would be to throw wave after wave of young Americans into the line of fire. The day before Crossfield was scheduled to ship out, he went up on a routine patrol. He flew out over the ocean alone with his thoughts, preparing himself for the fight. When he landed, however, he sensed immediately that something had changed.
And we didn't know what. We didn't know if it was good or bad, but something had happened. The atmosphere just told you that.
What had happened was the atomic bomb. Word spread quickly that a single bomb had wiped out an entire Japanese city and that the war would be over in a few days. The war, everyone believed, was as good as over. The thousands upon thousands of young men who had grimly prepared to be slaughtered in the invasion of Japan had been granted new life. Scott Crossfield, who had wanted so badly to serve in combat and would now be denied that experience, celebrated as hard as anyone. All those Marines he'd flown over on the beach, all those brave young men he'd imagined being cut up by machine gun fire, would instead go home alive. And so would he. After the end of World War II, Scott Crossfield joined the Naval Reserve and returned to Washington State. He led the Navy's 13th District Corsair Aerobatics team, becoming a kind of official barnstormer for naval aviation. But in 1948, he enrolled in the University of Washington to complete his aeronautical engineering degree. He'd married during the war, and he and his wife were on their way to what would eventually be 6 children. He thought about going back into the Navy, but decided he could make more money doing research at the University of Washington's wind tunnel. As the chief wind tunnel operator, he ran tests on the Goblin, a radical new airplane design. He studied where best to locate engines on new aircraft and helped usher in the jet age by testing swept-wing designs for a new generation of intercontinental bombers. He also earned his master's degree. There wasn't much money in being an aeronautical engineer in those days, so Crossfield decided to look for a job as a test pilot. He heard there was an opening for a test pilot at Moffett Field.
I decided not to ask them if I could come down because they'd say, "Oh, come down in a couple of weeks or make an appointment." It'd be too late, so I just went down and walked in their office. Surprisingly enough, they were expecting me.
At Moffett, he discovered that he was on the list to be interviewed for a test pilot job with the newly formed National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, a forerunner to NASA. The NACA was to be based at Muroc Field in the California desert. Crossfield hightailed it down to Muroc and landed the job. In aviation, there is no more storied time and place than Muroc in the 1950s. He was totally isolated and populated by a priesthood of hot test pilots. They were there not for money or glory, but for the pure adventure of going faster and higher than anyone had ever gone before. They were all decorated combat veterans, seat-of-the-pants tough guys who strapped in and took their chances. Crossfield, a degreed engineer with good but not outstanding flight credentials, arrived as a whole different kind of test pilot. Undaunted, he swung into the Muroc routine, which involved almost daily flight in untested aircraft that were as likely to crash as they were to fly. It was the era of the X-planes, aircraft designed to operate at higher speeds than could be wind tunnel tested.
They could do it in theory on a drawing board. They could do it in theory, by talking about the way things might happen and the way things should happen. But it wasn't until they actually got into the planes that they really knew for sure that it was going to work or not work.
The pace of the testing at Muroc was astounding. Crossfield flew the Skystreak, a research jet built by Douglas, and went up a few days later in the Northrop Bantam Skylancer. Apparently, feeling his oats, he tried to loop the plane. At the top of the loop, the engines flamed out, and the only thing that saved him was his own ability. A few weeks later, he made his first flight in the Douglas D-5582 Skyrocket. The Skyrocket was a rocket plane designed to test once and for all whether a swept-wing fighter could be controlled in flight. Crossfield launched from beneath the wing of a B-29 bomber and almost immediately found himself unable to see through the badly fogged windshield. Crossfield, directed by the pilots in his chase planes, brought the Skyrocket down safely. In 1951, 3 years after Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in the X-1, Crossfield made his first flight in the legendary craft. Carried aloft and released at 30,000 feet, the rocket plane flipped over and headed for the ground. Crossfield calmly rolled the plane back over, fired up its 4 rockets, and zoomed to more than 41,000 feet. There, the windshield iced over. Crossfield became a flight test legend by taking off one of his socks and using it to rub a hole through the ice. Peering through that hole, he landed safely.
It's a dangerous business. If you claim that you never got scared, you're a liar and you shouldn't be a test pilot. You didn't have good sense.
As the pilots and aircraft at Muroc performed more and more miracles, they came under more and more scrutiny. Fueled by the Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union, there was talk of a space race. The high ground of space became the real estate everyone worried about. The experiments at the newly renamed Edwards Air Force Base were suddenly too important to be left to mere pilots.
After the war, we had a lot of goggles and flying scarf fighter pilots who were doggone good aviators and did most of the test flying, but really didn't wholly participate in the analysis and determination of what that was doing. During the 50s, that all changed.
Crossfield, who as a degreed engineer had arrived at Edwards as something of an oddity, moved into the mainstream of the new Edwards. He continued to fly, of course, but also got more involved in design and theory. He played a key role in the development of the first full-body pressure suits, the precursor of the modern spacesuit. He test flew the Bell X-5, an aircraft designed to go more than 5 times the speed of sound, and helped develop aerodynamic parabolas, the first systematized method for artificially producing weightlessness in flight. In November 1953, he took the second Skyrocket up to more than twice the speed of sound, faster than anyone had ever gone before, and not long after, pushed the throttle up further than authorized to become the first man to fly at 3 times the speed of sound. Crossfield seemed, to those on the outside, as if he was right on the verge of popping through the atmosphere into outer space. He was brought back down to Earth by an F-100 prototype and one of the old seat-of-the-pants combat veterans that was on the way out at Edwards. During a landing, Crossfield's brakes failed. The world's fastest pilot crashed in slow motion through the wall of a hangar. Chuck Yeager, the first pilot to break the sound barrier, broke into a huge grin and let Crossfield have it. "The sonic wall was mine," Yeager announced. "The hangar wall is Crossfield's." One weekend in the 1950s, Scott Crossfield went fishing with Walt Williams, his boss at the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics. On the way home, they heard on the radio about the successful test of a rocket engine being developed for the Viking project. The engine produced the then amazing thrust of 75,000 pounds. The two started talking about the plane they could build with a 75,000-pound thrust rocket engine. Crossfield dug around in the glove compartment, got out a piece of scrap paper, and started making notes. Those notes were the genesis of the X-15, a rocket plane capable of flying into space, though not quite into Earth orbit.
When we first proposed it, I decided that I was going to follow that airplane. I didn't want to leave the committee, but it was just such an opportunity that I made a deal with 2 or 3 of the manufacturers that I wanted to talk to them about working on the airplane during its whole development and manufacture as an engineer, and then take it into flight test.
The concept for the X-15 kicked around NACA for a few years until the government awarded a contract for its construction to North American Aviation. True to his word, in 1955, Crossfield went to work for North American. He left a hole at the NACA that was nearly impossible for the agency to fill. Incredibly, during his 5 years there, Crossfield handled 38% of all the agency's research flying. The X-15 was designed to fly at altitudes over 250,000 feet and at speeds of 4,500 miles an hour. It had 2 different flight control systems, a conventional system of flaps and ailerons for use in the thick lower atmosphere, and a second system of thrusters for use on the boundaries of space. Also, because it was going to fly so fast, it would have to be made of lightweight materials that could stand the heat of re-entering the atmosphere. Crossfield worked on the X-15 for more than 3 years before it was ready to test. On June 8, 1959, he was in the cockpit when the X-15 first released from its B-52 mothership and glided safely to the dry lake bed at Edwards. 3 months later, he took the X-15 for its first powered flight.
And the X-15 was like a bucking stallion, I'll tell you. It was going to kill me, or we were in a Mexican standoff for a while. But we finally broke it, and it turned out to be a good mount.
Because of delays in the development of the X-15's main engine, the first few flights were carried out using a pair of smaller rocket engines. On Crossfield's third flight, one of those engines exploded. Unable to either jettison fuel or burn the fuel load in flight, Crossfield brought the plane in for an emergency landing much too heavy for the plane's lightweight frame. He landed it safely, but the X-15 snapped neatly in 2 just behind the pilot's cabin. Crossfield was uninjured, but the plane needed extensive repairs. The X-15 project, which had originated with the Air Force and Navy, became the property of the newly formed National Aeronautics and Space Administration. What NASA brought to the table, at least to the NACA veterans like Crossfield, was an added layer of bureaucracy that did nothing but slow everything down. Crossfield, who'd been around long enough to know better, spoke up every time he saw anything he didn't like.
I was inclined to stand on principle when all that did was get me kicked off a program, so I couldn't do anything about what I was arguing about. That doesn't make very good sense in hindsight, does it?
NASA would have loved to send Crossfield packing, but his standing at Edwards seemed to preclude that option. Besides, the agency didn't care that much about the X-15 program. Where Crossfield and the other NACA veterans saw the rocket plane as the natural stepping stone to manned spaceflight, NASA saw it as a kind of sideshow. At best, a technology testbed, and at worst, a drain on precious funds. The future for NASA was Project Mercury, a rocket and capsule-based space program that would use little of the technology developed at Edwards. All the same, testing of the X-15 continued. Without anyone making much fuss about it, the X-15 started regularly flying above 50 kilometers, the generally recognized boundary between Earth and space. Twice, it flew above the so-called Kármán line, 100 kilometers above the planet's surface. But it was clear, once NASA committed to Project Mercury, that the cutting edge of what had come to be called aerospace would no longer make its home at Edwards. Crossfield made a passing attempt to become an astronaut, but was warned off by a friend. NASA, it seemed, was more interested in pilots who were media-friendly than they were in pilots who were outspoken. In 1960, Crossfield won the International Harmon Trophy as the world's outstanding aviator. A year later, he stepped away from flight testing completely, becoming Director of Space and Missile System Tests at North American. He helped develop the Hound Dog air-to-ground missile system and consulted with NASA on proposals for the Saturn booster rocket and the Apollo command and service modules. His disagreements with NASA continued, however, when he complained that NASA's use of pressurized pure oxygen in launch training was too dangerous. NASA cut its ties with Crossfield. Soon after, a flash fire in the command module of Apollo 1 killed astronauts Grissom, White, and Chaffee.
We knew it was going to happen, and we fought like hell to find another way to do that ground test where we were going to have that very high total pressure of pure oxygen in that cockpit. But no, sir, NASA was going to do it their way, and I was told to shut up or get off the program.
In 1967, Crossfield became Director of Flight Research for Eastern Airlines and did pioneering work in commercial application of short takeoff and landing aircraft. He helped develop a navigation system that eased air congestion in the Washington-New York-Boston corridor. In 1975, after a stint at Hawker Siddeley Aviation, he became a technical consultant to the House of Representatives Committee on Science and Technology, focusing on problems posed by the growth in air travel. His influence on Congress's aviation policy was significant, and at his behest, Congress developed the computerized air traffic management system in use to this day. Through all the years, however, he never forgot the potential that went unrealized in the X-15. He became a vocal advocate for a national space plane and a high-visibility booster of the future of space flight.